There is a magnet in your headphones. If you're wearing earbuds right now, it's about the size of a shirt button, sitting behind a paper-thin membrane. And in almost every pair sold it is the thing that turns an electrical signal into sound. Pull the driver apart and you'd find a small gray disc that weighs almost nothing and costs almost nothing. By every outside estimate available, something close to 9 out of every 10 of those discs are made in one country. And it isn't the country that dug up the material. Let me put a number underneath that before I go anywhere else, because it's the kind of sentence that's easy to say and hard to defend. In 2025, the United States mined more rare earth material than it has in decades. 51,000 tons of rare earth oxide equivalent in mineral concentrates, up from 45,500 the year before. That's the United States Geological Survey's own estimate, published in February 2026. A record, a genuine, measurable win for a policy that a lot of people spent a lot of money on. And in the same document, a few lines further down the same table, the survey estimates that America's net import reliance for rare earth compounds and metals went up that year, from 53% to 67%. I'll be fair about that pair of numbers because there's context in the row that cuts both ways. As recently as 2023, that same reliance figure sat above 90%. So 53% in 2024 was a real improvement on where America started. 67% in 2025 is the year it gave a chunk of that improvement back, in the same 12 months that mine output hit a record. You mined more and you got more dependent. Both of those are printed by the same agency on the same page, and the gap between them is the whole story. Because there is a step in this supply chain that almost nobody names out loud, and it sits between the rock and the earbud. That step is where the actual control lives. And by the time we get there, I think you'll agree that the argument everybody has been having for the last 5 years, the one about mines, was an argument about the wrong object. Let me start with the object you're holding. The magnet in a good pair of headphones is almost certainly neodymium. More precisely, it's a sintered alloy of neodymium, iron and boron, which the industry writes as NdFeB, and everyone pronounces as Neo. Here's what makes it worth anything. A permanent magnet is a piece of matter that holds a magnetic field without being plugged into anything. That sounds unremarkable until you try to build a small speaker. A dynamic driver, the kind in almost every earbud, headphone, laptop, and phone, works by pushing a coil of wire back and forth inside a fixed magnetic field. The stronger the field you can pack into a given volume, the smaller you can make everything else and still get bass out of it. Engineers measure that with something called maximum energy product, and NdFeB has the highest of any permanent magnet manufactured commercially. That's the entire reason it ends up in consumer products. Not elegance and not marketing. It stores more magnetic energy per unit of volume than the alternatives, which is exactly what you need when the whole assembly has to fit in an ear canal. You can build a small speaker with a cheaper ferrite magnet, and plenty of products do. You just accept a bigger magnet, a weaker field, or less output for the same size, so the same family of magnet turns up in your earbuds, in the little vibration motor in your phone, in the latch that snaps your charging case shut, in the motor of an electric car, in the generator of a wind turbine, in the hard drive of a data center server. The specific recipes differ. The ones that have to survive heat get extra ingredients that an earbud never needs. But the base material is the same and it comes from the same industry. Wildly different stakes, one supply chain. The Geological Survey estimates that the leading global use of rare earths, across all of them, is magnets. And this is where I have to tell you that rare earths is one of the worst named categories in industry. They aren't rare. Cerium is about as common in the Earth's crust as copper. What's rare is finding them in concentrations dense enough to dig up profitably, and, the part that matters here, separating them from each other, because chemically, they are near identical siblings that refuse to be told apart without a lot of chemistry, a lot of solvent, and a lot of patience. That's the metal. Now look at what happens when you try to buy it. If you followed any of this in the press over the last 2 years, you followed the mining scoreboard. How many tons came out of the ground, in which country, under which flag? Here's that scoreboard as of the February 2026 Geological Survey numbers. World mine production in 2025 came to about 390,000 tons. China accounted for 270,000 of that. The United States, 51,000, its best year on record. worth about $240 million at the mine. On reserves, the picture looks friendlier than you'd expect. The 2026 edition puts world reserves above 75 million tons, with China holding 44 million. America is not standing there with an empty bucket either. 1,900,000 tons of reserves, and measured and indicated resources of 3.6 million tons in the United States and more than 14 million in Canada. Read that scoreboard on its own and you'd conclude the problem is basically solved, or at least solvable with a shovel and a decade. Now here's the second set of numbers from the same 2 pages, and this is the part that never makes the headline. American imports of rare earth compounds and metals rose 169% in 2025. Apparent domestic consumption went from 9,000 tons to 27,000 tons. Exports of ores and compounds collapsed, 37,500 tons in 2024, down to 14,000 in 2025. And the value of those swollen imports actually fell, from $168 million to $165 million. America roughly tripled the volume of rare earth material it was buying from abroad, and paid slightly less money for it. There's only one way that happens. What you're buying moved down the value chain. Cheaper stuff, earlier stuff, less finished stuff. And I'm not inferring that, because the survey writes the reason into its own text in one clause. A shift toward lower-value imported products. So the finishing is being done somewhere. It just isn't being done at the end you're standing on. Between we dug up ore and there is a magnet in your earbud, there are 4 distinct industrial stages, and the public conversation has been arguing about the first one. Stage 1, mining, gets you rock. Stage 2, separation, gets you individual oxides, one element at a time. That's the chemistry-heavy part, and it's the one people have finally started paying attention to. Stage 3 turns oxide into metal, and Stage 4 is the one with no catchy name. You alloy that metal with iron and boron, jet mill it into powder finer than flour. Press the powder inside a magnetic field so every grain lines up, sinter it in a furnace, machine it, and coat it against corrosion. Then comes the expensive part, which isn't a machine at all. You get it qualified by a customer who will not accept it until it has survived their thermal cycling, their vibration testing, and their paperwork. That 4th stage is the magnet. And it is a manufacturing business, not a mining business. It runs on process know-how, furnace time, tolerances, and certifications. So how concentrated is it? The United States International Trade Commission published a paper in October 2024 that put hard numbers on this. It found China supplied 69% of rare earth mine production in 2023 and 92% of NdFeB magnet production in 2022. Look at the shape of those 2 figures. 69 and 92. The grip tightens as you move away from the rock, not toward it. More recent estimates land in the same place. The International Energy Agency puts China's share of rare earth magnet production at roughly 90%. Independent industry counts for 2025 land around 300,000 tons of high-performance NdFeB out of a global total in the low 300,000s. These are estimates by outside analysts, not audited production ledgers. Nobody outside China gets to walk the floor and count furnaces, so treat the exact digit as approximate. But every credible source lands in the same neighborhood, and no source anywhere puts it below 85%. The Trade Commission paper also cited a measurement I hadn't seen applied here before, and it's the single most useful number in this entire story. Economists measure how concentrated an industry is with something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. You square each producer's market share and add them all up. Below 1,500, a market counts as competitive. Above 2,500, American merger guidelines classify it as highly concentrated. In 2022, the Department of Energy published a deep dive assessment of the rare earth permanent magnet supply chain and ran that calculation on global NdFeB magnet manufacturing. It came back at 8,514. Not 1,500, not 2,500. 8,500 against a theoretical maximum of 10,000, which is the number you'd get if exactly one company on Earth made the product. The Trade Commission then ran a second, different method on America's import dependence for these magnets specifically, and got a figure just under 8,000. The paper draws the conclusion I've been circling this whole time, and it draws it flatly. Because magnet production outside China is minimal, an increase in United States production would lower that index, but on its own could not bring it down to low risk. Take that as a business statement rather than a policy one. The government's own analysts in 2024 wrote down that America building magnet plants is not sufficient. Not insufficient so far. Not sufficient arithmetically as a category, which raises the obvious question. Why not? What's the arithmetic? Here it is. This is the number that explains every strange headline of the last month. And once you have it, none of them are strange anymore. Start with what America is actually building. And America is building. This is the part I need to be precise about because you'll hear people say the United States can't make these magnets, and that isn't true. It makes them today. The question is how many? USA Rare Earth commissioned a magnet line in Stillwater, Oklahoma. It expects to reach full capacity of 600 tons a year by the end of December 2026, with a second line taking the site to 1,200 tons a year in the first quarter of 2027. MP Materials is spending $1.25 billion on a Texas campus that would take its total capacity to roughly 10,000 tons a year. Now put those against 300,000 tons. 1,200 tons is 0.4% of Chinese output. 10,000 tons, and the flagship, the billion-dollar campus, the one that gets the press conferences, is a little over 3%. And the clearest statement of the arithmetic doesn't come from a critic. It comes from a company building one of these plants in its own press release about its own project. Niron Magnetics announced in March 2026 that it was site hunting for a second American plant. 1.6 million square feet, up to 10,000 tons of magnets a year, up to $1.8 billion of capital, more than 700 jobs. Construction anticipated to begin in early 2028, and here is Niron's own estimate of what all that buys. In its own words, approximately 1 to 2% of the global permanent magnet market share, $1.8 billion. Ground broken in 2028, 1 to 2%. That's the number. And it didn't come from a short seller or a critic. The company put it in the same paragraph as its own good news. Because it's describing a real project rather than selling a fantasy. Now, plant capacity doesn't add up as neatly as a spreadsheet suggests, and the global denominator will move over 10 years. But even generously, the shape doesn't change. Closing a gap this size at 1 to 2% per $1.8 billion plant is not a 5-year project, and it isn't a 10-year project either. It's a generational industrial program, and the money spent so far has bought the opening few percent of it. So when you see a Western government spending heavily on something that sounds like it's going around the problem rather than through it, that's not confusion. That's people who have done this arithmetic. Which brings us to the 3 bets currently on the table. If the neodymium magnet is the choke point, the cleanest escape is a magnet that doesn't need neodymium. Not less of it. None. This is a real research field with real 2026 results. And the results are more interesting than the headlines about them. In January 2026, a group at Georgetown University's physics department, Professors Kai Lu and Gen Yin, with graduate student Willie Beeson, published in the journal Advanced Materials a new class of strong magnets built from what are called high-entropy borides, cheap transition metals and boron, no rare earths, and no precious metals either. Their method is worth a sentence because it's why they got anywhere. Instead of making one candidate material at a time, they sprayed several metals together onto a heated surface at once, producing roughly 50 slightly different recipes side by side in a single run, all under identical conditions. Then they measured which recipes held their magnetic direction best. On that measurement, how stubbornly the material resists being pushed out of alignment, the best ones come close to the rare earth magnets already in use. That's a real result. Here's the part that got trimmed out of most coverage. Those are thin films in the micrometer range made in a laboratory. Whether you can scale one into a bulk magnet that holds up inside a car motor is, as of today, unknown. Meanwhile, at Ames National Laboratory in Iowa, the approach is to search rather than to synthesize. Ames researchers have been combining physics-based modeling, high-throughput simulation, and machine learning to evaluate vastly more candidate compounds than trial and error allows, as part of the Department of Energy's Genesis mission. A related American effort produced a searchable database of 67,573 magnetic compounds and reported 25 of them as materials not previously identified in the literature as staying magnetic at high temperature. And in Germany, at the Institute for Materials Research in Aalen, a master's researcher named Kathryn Geiger is working in the group of professors Dagmar Gohl and Gerhard Schneider on hard magnetic phases, the parts of a permanent magnet that actually do the magnetizing, and has produced and characterized phase compositions that had not been described before. Her substitution of interest is cerium, still a rare earth, but far more abundant and far less contested than neodymium. Whether a cerium base phase can carry the load neodymium carries is exactly what the research is for. That question is open. Now, one honest note about how that German story reached you, because it's a small lesson in reading any of these. The headline said, researchers in Aalen are developing magnets without critical raw materials. The article underneath it, the university's own description, the researchers' own words, says magnets with fewer critical raw materials that still deliver high performance. Those are different claims. The second one is the true one, and it's still a good story. The first one is a headline doing what headlines do. That's the state of Bet one. One genuinely commercial player, Niron, spun out of the University of Minnesota in 2013 with Department of Energy backing, making iron nitride magnets with no rare earths at all, plus a research frontier that is active, well-funded, and years from a car motor. The second bet says the material's already here. It's in the drawer. The scale is not small. The United Nations Global E-Waste Monitor counted a record 62 million tons of electronic waste generated in 2022. Fewer than a quarter of it, 22.3%, was documented as formally collected and recycled, and the report values the recoverable materials outside that formal system at around $62 billion. Waste generation is rising by roughly 2.6 million tons a year, on track for 82 million tons by 2030. And the share of world rare earth demand currently met by recycling? 1%. That's the gap the urban mining pitch is built on, and it explains a set of deals that look odd until you see the magnet as the product. Apple and MP Materials announced in July 2025 a $500 million agreement for magnets made in Fort Worth, Texas, entirely from recycled feedstock, post-industrial scrap, and end-of-life magnets recovered and processed at the company's California site. Shipments expected to start in 2027, and Apple's 2026 environmental report states that the magnets across its product line are now made with 100% recycled rare earth elements. That's the company's own accounting of its own supply chain, and nobody outside Apple audits it. But if it holds, the disc in a new pair of their earbuds is made of somebody's old device. Then in July 2026, the Pentagon announced a $25 million investment in ReElement Technologies to expand production lines in Marion, Indiana, refining end-of-life magnets and other recycled feedstock into high-purity rare earth oxides. The intended destination is defense hardware, which is worth saying plainly because it explains why a government is writing a check to a recycling company at all. Intended, though. An investment in refining capacity is not the same thing as material that has been qualified and installed. I'll give you the caveat that came with that one because it matters. ReElement had earlier been discussed alongside a much larger $80 million conditional loan commitment from the Pentagon's Office of Strategic Capital. Reuters reported the company stopped pursuing that loan after struggling to satisfy federal due diligence requirements. The $25 million is real and announced. That $80 million is a different story with a different ending. And anybody quoting the two together as $105 million of government support is quoting a number that doesn't exist. The third position on the table belongs to people whose job is to be right about the previous two. None of what follows is a recommendation about any share price, and I hold no position in any of these companies. What's worth your attention is the reasoning, because the reasoning is about factories rather than tickers. The Financial Times, using lending data from S&P Global Market Intelligence, reported this year that hedge funds have been raising bearish positions across American critical minerals companies. Shares of United States Antimony out on loan, the standard proxy for short selling, climbed from 23% of market capitalization to 42%. American Resources went from about 9% at the end of 2025 to around 23%. Short interest in MP materials and USA rare earth rose as well, though MP has pointed out that a chunk of its increase reflects arbitrage tied to its convertible bonds rather than outright bets against the business. A fair correction, and worth keeping in mind before reading any single short interest figure as pure conviction. The thesis behind those positions is not that magnets are unimportant. It's the opposite. It's that share prices moved at the speed of announcements while factories move at the speed of concrete, and that China retains the ability to increase supply and push prices down far enough to make a new Western plant uneconomic before it ever runs at capacity. Siegfried Eggert of Grizzly Research put it as certain stocks being lifted by government rhetoric ahead of the underlying economics. You can disagree with that read. What you can't do is call it uninformed. It is the same arithmetic Niron published about its own plant, held the other way around. And the pressure behind it is real because these companies now sit on both sides of a policy fight. China has added MP materials and USA rare earth to its own export control list, citing their military links, after Washington restricted several Chinese firms. Meanwhile, the Geological Survey records that China tightened export controls on 7 rare earth elements in April 2025, among them dysprosium and terbium, the two that make a magnet survive heat, then widened the list to 5 more elements in October, then suspended the October editions for 1 year in November, while keeping April's in force. Controls that can be switched off for 12 months can be switched back on in 12 months. That's not a rule. That's a dial. While all 3 bets were being placed, China's Ministry of Natural Resources announced in March 2026 that a new round of exploration at the Mountyupping mine in Mianning County, Sichuan, had confirmed roughly 9.7 million tons of rare earth oxide. The exploration team logged more than 60,000 meters of drilling in a single year to reach the deep ore body, and the same survey turned up 27 million tons of fluorite and 37 million tons of baryte alongside it. Now, I want to show you something about that number because I went looking for what it actually means, and the answer is unresolved. Every outlet reporting this cites the same government announcement. Chinese state broadcast coverage described 9.67 million tons as the mine's new total. Coverage citing the state news agency described 9.7 million tons as newly confirmed reserves, raising the site's total to 10.4 million. A third figure circulating in the trade press puts the resulting total at 11.46 million. Same announcement, 3 different totals. That is not a rounding difference. It's the difference between an increment and a sum, and nobody outside the ministry can settle it because there is no independently audited reserve statement here of the kind a Western stock listing would require. So here's what I'll say and no more. Something on the order of 9.5 to 10 million tons of rare earth oxide was confirmed at one Chinese mine in a single year of drilling, which is enough to rank it second among the countries producing light rare earth deposits after Bayan Obo. Take the precise total with the salt it deserves. The direction survives the discount. The country that already dominates the finishing step has announced it holds considerably more of the starting material than anyone had counted. So where does that leave the disc in your ear? Here's the detail I keep coming back to, and it's buried in the least dramatic document in this entire story. In the 2026 Geological Survey summaries, under the section on the American government stockpile, the potential acquisitions listed for fiscal year 2025 include 300 tons of neodymium praseodymium oxide, the ingredient, and, listed separately, 450 tons of neodymium iron-boron magnet block. Magnet block, not ore, not oxide. The finished part. I'll give you my read on that, and you're free to reject it. There are ordinary reasons a government buys finished components: lead times, surge capacity, qualifying a contractor. But a country confident it could make the part at the volume it needs would be buying the ingredient. Buying the finished block is a hedge against the step it doesn't yet control, written in the driest possible language. That's the answer to the question this started with. The fight was never really about who owns the rocks. America has 1.9 million tons of reserves and just had its best mining year in decades. The fight is about who owns the furnace, the tolerance, the coating, and the qualification paperwork. Those are boring. Boring is exactly why the position was available to take and why nobody noticed it being taken. I don't know which of the 3 bets pays. Probably some blend over a longer horizon than any of the announcements imply. What I'm fairly sure of is this. The next time somebody tells you a country has secured its supply chain because it opened a mine, you now have the follow-up question that costs them something to answer. Where does the magnet get made? I'd like to know where you're watching from and whether anything near you actually makes this stuff. A magnet plant? A recycler? A separation facility? Drop the city in the comments. I read them.